Urartu was not built to be seen from the plains. It was built to watch them. High above the valleys, above the roads, above the armies that moved through the ancient Near East, there was a kingdom of stone, iron, horses, and mountain fortresses. And for a time, even mighty Assyria had to look north and understand one thing. Nineveh was not alone in its hunger for power. Before the world remembered Armenia, before Persia reshaped the map, before the name Urartu became a shadow in old inscriptions, there was a kingdom rising around Lake Van. Its walls climbed over rocks. Its kings carved their victories into stone. Its temples honored a war god. And its existence created one of the great rivalries of the Iron Age, the Empire of Assyria against the Kingdom of the Mountains. This is Empires Lost in Time, and today we are entering Urartu, the forgotten kingdom of the mountains and the great northern rival of Nineveh. If you enjoy cinematic journeys through lost empires, ancient ruins, and civilizations buried beneath time, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is not just about a kingdom that vanished. It is about a power strong enough to challenge the most feared empire of its age. To understand Urartu, you have to change the landscape in your mind. Do not picture the wide river plains of Mesopotamia, where Assyrian armies marched beneath open skies. Picture mountains, cold air, high plateaus, deep valleys, lakes shining like metal, and fortresses placed where the land itself becomes a weapon. This was not a kingdom that copied the world of Nineveh. It answered it from above. The Assyrians called it Urartu. The people of the kingdom called their land Biainili. And at the center of that world stood Tushpa, near modern Van, built beside the waters of Lake Van and watched over by a massive rock citadel. From there, Urartian kings tried to control a world that stretched through difficult terrain between lakes, mountains, roads, tribes, farms, and borderlands. And that is what makes Urartu so fascinating. It was not just a remote mountain culture hiding from history. It was organized, ambitious, and dangerous. It built fortresses, moved resources, controlled agricultural zones, raised armies, bred horses, worked metal, and left inscriptions behind. It understood something every mountain kingdom must understand. If you cannot dominate the open plain, you dominate the routes that lead into it. At first, Assyria looked at the northern highlands as a place to raid, pressure, and control. Assyrian kings were used to demanding tribute, punishing resistance, and turning enemies into warnings carved on palace walls. But Urartu was different. The mountains absorbed invasion. Fortresses slowed armies. Distance became defense. And little by little, the northern enemy became a real political problem. Now, here is the part that matters. Urartu rose in the same age that Assyria was becoming one of the most aggressive empires the world had ever seen. So this rivalry was not just about territory. It was about two systems of power facing each other. Assyria was the empire of the plains, roads, siege engines, deportations, and royal terror. Urartu was the kingdom of highlands, stone citadels, waterworks, and fortified control. The Urartian kings understood architecture as intimidation. A fortress was not only a military structure, it was a statement. It told the valley below that someone was watching. It told rival tribes that the king was present even when he was far away. It told Assyria that the north could not simply be swallowed in one campaign. Every wall was a sentence written in stone. And then came the great builders. Kings like Menua and Argishti expanded the kingdom's reach and turned Urartu into a network of power. Canals carried water through difficult landscapes. Fortresses rose over strategic points. Storehouses held grain, wine, and supplies. Temples honored Haldi, the supreme god of the Urartians, a god tied to kingship, war, and victory. This was not a loose mountain world anymore. It was a state. One of the clearest symbols of that ambition was Erebuni, founded by Argishti I in the Ararat Plain. Imagine the scene: a fortress placed on a hill, walls rising over the land, inscriptions declaring royal authority, and below it, a plain that had to understand a new message. Urartu was not only defending itself, it was expanding. It was projecting power into the Caucasus and turning geography into strategy. And for Assyria, that was unacceptable. Nineveh and its kings could tolerate many things, but they could not tolerate a rival controlling the northern routes, threatening allies, contesting influence, and standing as proof that Assyrian power had limits. The conflict between Assyria and Urartu became a long pressure point. Sometimes war, sometimes trade, sometimes diplomacy, but always tension. If this story is pulling you in, leave a like and subscribe to Empires Lost in Time. These forgotten kingdoms matter because they remind us that history was never controlled by one empire alone. Beyond every imperial map, there was always another people waiting in the mountains. The Assyrians struck hard. Tiglath-Pileser III campaigned against Urartu and even laid siege to Tushpa. Later, Sargon II launched one of the most famous Assyrian campaigns into Urartian territory in 714 BC. And this is where the story becomes almost cinematic. An Assyrian king pushing through harsh lands, trying to break the northern rival, while Urartu fought to survive behind distance, altitude, and stone. Assyria could win battles. Assyria could burn temples, seize treasures, and humiliate kings. But it could not erase the problem completely. Urartu remained there, wounded at times, pressured, forced to rebuild, but still present. And that is the strange power of this kingdom. It did not need to defeat Assyria forever to become important. It only needed to survive long enough to prove that Assyria was not invincible. Inside Urartu, life was more than war. The kingdom had fields, vineyards, herds, metalworkers, administrators, priests, and builders. Its landscapes produced grain, fruit, wine, and animals. Its artisans created bronze objects, weapons, plaques, belts, and ritual pieces. And through all of this, you can feel a civilization trying to organize a difficult world into something permanent. But permanence is exactly where ancient history becomes cruel, because the very system that made Urartu strong also made it vulnerable. Fortresses can control territory, but they can also become isolated. Mountains can protect a kingdom, but they can also divide it. A state built around royal campaigns, border control, and military pressure must keep proving its strength again and again. By the 7th century BC, the world around Urartu was changing. Assyria was still dangerous, but new threats were moving across the map. Cimmerians, Scythians, and later the Medes entered the wider story. The old balance was breaking. And when multiple enemies press against a kingdom already weakened by war, pressure does not arrive as a single blow. It arrives like winter, slowly, from every direction. This is why the fall of Urartu feels so mysterious. There is no single dramatic scene that explains everything. No one clean moment where the curtain drops and the kingdom disappears. Instead, there are burned sites, abandoned fortresses, changing powers, broken lines of control, and silence where royal inscriptions once spoke with confidence. Urartu fades the way many mountain kingdoms fade, not into one fire, but into layers. Some cities were destroyed. Some fortresses were reused. Some populations remained and were absorbed into the worlds that followed. The Medes, the Persians, and later Armenian history would reshape the region. And as new names entered the map, Urartu became harder to see. Not because it had never mattered, but because later civilizations stood on top of its memory. And maybe that is the most haunting part. Urartu was once powerful enough to challenge Assyria, yet today many people barely know its name. Nineveh became famous through the Bible, archaeology, imperial records, and the drama of its fall. Urartu, on the other hand, survived in fragments, inscriptions on rock, fortress walls on hills, bronze objects in museums, and ruins watching over lakes. But those fragments still speak. They tell us that the ancient Near East was not only a story of Mesopotamian empires marching outward, it was also a story of highland kingdoms pushing back. It was a story of people who understood water, stone, horses, metal, and altitude. It was a story of kings who looked down from mountain citadels and believed their world could outlast the empires below. When you imagine Urartu, do not imagine a weak kingdom hiding at the edge of civilization. Imagine torches burning on fortress walls above Lake Van. Imagine soldiers watching mountain passes. Imagine priests invoking Haldi before campaigns. Imagine canals carrying water through dry land. Imagine Assyrian envoys looking upward at walls that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. And then imagine the silence after it was gone. The fortresses still stood, but the royal voice faded. The roads changed hands. The temples lost their old ceremonies. The inscriptions remained, but fewer and fewer people could read the world they described. Urartu did not disappear because it was insignificant. It disappeared because time is merciless, even to kingdoms made of stone. That is the legacy of Urartu. It was the forgotten rival of Assyria, the mountain kingdom that forced Nineveh to defend its northern horizon, the state that turned highlands into power and fortresses into memory. It rose where the land was difficult, fought where empires struggled, and vanished into the very mountains that once protected it. So when we look at the ruins of Urartu today, we are not just looking at old walls. We are looking at a warning. Even the strongest citadel cannot hold back every invasion, every migration, every political collapse, every century of forgetting. But it can leave behind enough for us to ask the question again. How many kingdoms changed the world and then disappeared before the world learned their names? If you want to continue this journey through lost empires, forgotten cities, and civilizations buried beneath time, watch the next documentary from Empires Lost in Time. Because every ruin has a voice. And sometimes, the quietest ruins belong to kingdoms that once made empires afraid.